Hello everybody, this is Fernando for the latest Mafia and Gangsters video. I thought I would mix one of these in while I'm continuing the Cryptids and Monsters video, so I'm going to do definitely more of those too, but I wanted to mix this one in because I was alerted to the fact that a lot of my other previous Mafia and Gangsters videos now have a great number of views on them, several thousand of them in fact, on some of them. So it looks like those videos are finding their audience, and so I just wanted to make sure I could continue inserting some here. And as always, the whole theme on this is picking on some of the more lesser known gangsters and mafia members out there, and in that way a lot of people that love that world or love reading about that world like I do can find out this information, such is the case here. Yet again, another not really well known in terms of movies or in terms of news mafia member, but he absolutely still had a big mark in the mafia world. And you're looking at him now. He went by the name of Joseph Corrao, but as always, when it comes to the world of mafia members, they have, in this case, a nickname, and he was known as Joseph Butch Corrao. So let's go ahead and let's talk about, or Joe Butch Corrao as well. So let's go ahead and let's talk about all the information associated with this lifelong gangster. So who was this Joe Butch Corrao? Well, he was someone, again, who basically for his entire life, almost to his dying days, was a made member of the mafia. He was born sometime in 1936 to be specific, and then early on in his life he was introduced into the world of mafia, and that's because his own father and his uncle were made members of the Gambino crime family. So it's just pretty much one son passing along to another generational son when it comes to this lifestyle. His father was also, again, someone in the mafia, but he went by the name of Vinny the Shrimp Corrao. So who knows how he got that name specifically. But sure enough, whenever he came of age, this guy, Joe Butch Corrao, he went ahead and joined the mafia crew. In fact, whenever he eventually became a capo within his family, he in turn inherited his own father's crew. Pretty interesting on that too, huh? Because in some cases, they kind of had to start from scratch, but no, in this case he absolutely just took on his father's own crew, and they were pretty close to their boss at the time, Paul Castellano, who you're looking at here. Paul Castellano, of course, would be famous for being assassinated later on. More on that here in just a minute. But yes, this guy and his crew were involved in the usual mafia racketeering stuff, like in this case loan sharking, extortion, gambling, and then also other forms of racketeering. And of course, he did so under the guise of legitimate businesses. I say those in quotation marks, including owning, almost like a staple in the mafia at the time, several well-known restaurants, including a restaurant called Taormina, and then another one called Cafe Biondo. This Taormina was especially notorious because this was a place that was frequented by John Gotti himself when he was rising through the mafia crew before he became boss afterward. More on their relationship too with regards to that. But yes, he was there in the mafia world doing all that stuff, as far as, and doing very well. In fact, he was able to get a good number of dollars going for his mafia head, and then also from his mafia crew. Part of his success again had to do with how they would incorporate real world businesses into their illegitimate stuff. Like for example, he had a controlling interest in a company called Bayside Fuel, and they essentially allowed or placed heating oil inside very large housing complexes. I imagine that, like, if you went to one of those large apartment complexes or those condos, whatever they may be, there was probably like a large supply or maybe individual supplies of this heating oil for those complexes. So he in turn would help supply for them. You would think that would be okay, right? Like this would be something that is 100% just as is. So the customers pay for the heating oil and then they supply it. But no, as is the world of, in this case, the mafia, they also found a way here to skim money off of this oil. And what they would do is this: the customers or whoever owned those housing complexes would pay for the heating oil. This company would come and then also, try to transport this heating oil into those things, but they would actually pump a lot of air into the housing complexes themselves. So in other words, they were getting ripped off. Instead of getting the needed oil or the needed fuel, they would in turn get practically nothing, just pure air. I'm sure there was some fuel fixed in there to make it seem more legitimate, but they were still getting ripped off, and then the mafia members would take all that profit and then split it with some of their other bosses. And this eventually caught notice, though, with the New York Housing Authority. They found out about this, and when that happened, they terminated many of those contracts. So even then, it goes to show that it was probably allowed as long as it was unnoticeable, but I'm sure people eventually started realizing, and greed got in the way, and that's when they had to do something. In this case, the housing authority, lest there be a lot of public backlash. But yes, all that at least continued. He still had other successful businesses, those restaurants, all those other things I mentioned, and all of this under his family boss, Paul Castellano. However, he was of course murdered back on December 1985, to be specific, murdered as well by John Gotti and his crew. This guy, this Joseph Corrao, was not a fan of that. He was pretty close to Paul Castellano. So when he heard about this Joe Butch, he was not happy. And then also he was not happy about the fact that this was a blatant violation of La Cosa Nostra's rules. To have this kind of big assassination done, you have to have authority or approval from a lot of the other families out there, but John Gotti did not seek that approval, so he was not happy about that. Plus, he was not happy about the way John Gotti conducted himself. When I was reading this information, it was interesting to note that the way John Gotti had his meetings thereafter, it was all done under one restaurant. I think it was even one of his restaurants, and it was all basically all the members had to go there. They all had to meet, and it wasn't like he was making this secret. No, he was like broadcasting it, almost telling to the FBI, the police, anyone else that was investigating that yes, he was conducting business on a specific day. I think it was Wednesday of every week in a very specific spot. This just totally went against the secretive world of the mafia, and he was not happy about that. This guy Joseph Corrao, but still he went and he under the new leadership of John Gotti, he continued making money. In fact, he was a favorite guy of John Gotti when it came to the amount of money he made, and that's how he stayed in his favor. He also, this guy Joe Butch, also had people on payroll in prominent positions. For example, he had an FBI clerk on his payroll, and he was able to keep John Gotti informed of anything as far as any indictments coming soon. So imagine that, like, that's a great way to keep ahead of the FBI, and then that way if they knew something was coming, then they could prepare for it ahead of time, well in advance, and make certain that they could counter it with the necessary measures. But eventually this guy Joe Butch Corrao, he went ahead and got indicted on federal racketeering charges. This was back in 1986. He eventually though was able to beat them. I think it took about a year, but he was acquitted of these charges. But since then he was still not too happy about John Gotti's rule, and then also John Gotti getting into his own trouble with courts. And so eventually, and I was trying to read more information on this, but I couldn't get much on it. But eventually, this guy, Joe Butch Corrao, he cut a deal with the feds. I guess he told a little bit of info about John Gotti to the feds, and he got himself a plea deal. He got some kind of reduced sentence down to, like, I think it was 6 years or so, as opposed to many, many more years in jail. Of course, John Gotti was not too happy about that, but he couldn't do much on his end because he himself was going to jail. So Joe Butch Corrao, he went to jail, only served a couple years. He got out, I think, from prison in 1998, but by then he was already a very sick person. I think that played into his decision too, because he had something. He apparently he had like a hard case of diabetes, something in him that was almost fatal, and so he probably saw the end of his life coming soon, and he didn't want to spend it in jail. So that's just my own thoughts on why he might have done something like that. But once he got out of jail, he was not much involved within the mafia world thereafter, and then he ended up passing away in 2001 of kidney failure, I think also related to the diabetes. And then that was it. That was his whole life, essentially, almost in the mafia down to his final days. But that's all the info associated with this guy, this Joe Butch Corrao. He also had a son, by the way, who went into the mafia world too. His name was Vincent Corrao, and he went by Vinny Butch as far as his nickname. But I might do a video on him later on too. But yes, here we have yet another perfect example of a lifelong mafia member, pretty much almost beating the rap short of just a few years, and then finally just dying out on his own. If anybody has any more info about this Joseph Corrao, maybe anybody that knew about those restaurants. I'm always fascinated whenever these mafia guys own restaurants, because they are legitimate restaurants, or they were if they're already closed. They were places that people went to eat, probably even prominent members, and I always wonder if anybody ever went to one while the mafia members were fully running them. I mean, they had everything. They had waiters, they had cooks. I mean, it was a real restaurant. But they just happened to run illegal things on the side with them. So if anybody has that info, that'd be good to share too. So, alright, everybody. Thanks again as always. Take care.